Byron Nelson respected almost everyone in golf, but there were 5 men he could never truly respect. This video explores the untold side of Byron Nelson. Not the wins, not the records, but the quiet decisions he made about the people around him. In a sport built on tradition and respect, his silence spoke louder than any rivalry. From Sam Snead to Ben Hogan, from Gene Sarazen to Ralph Guldahl and Craig Wood, this is not a story about hatred. It is a story about standards, about discipline, about the quiet line that Byron Nelson never allowed anyone to cross. If you enjoy classic golf stories, legendary rivalries, and deeper insights into the golden age of golf, this is a story you have never heard told this way. Subscribe for more untold stories about golf legends and the moments history left behind. What does it take for a man to be respected by everyone and still choose not to respect a few? What kind of silence carries more weight than anger? And why would a man known for his calm, his discipline, his quiet dignity, decide that certain names were never worth his words? In golf, respect is not given lightly. It is built slowly, over years, through pressure, through failure, through the way a man carries himself when no one is watching. But there are moments, subtle, almost invisible, when respect is withheld, not with confrontation, not with bitterness, but with distance. There is an old account from a tournament in the early 1940s. A reporter stood near the practice area watching Byron Nelson move through a small group of players. He greeted most of them the same way, a nod, a quiet word, a presence that felt steady, almost reassuring. But then something shifted. When one particular player approached, Nelson did not stop. He did not slow down. He acknowledged him, but only just enough to move past. No conversation, no warmth, no second glance. The reporter would later say it wasn't rude. It was something else, something colder, as if in that brief moment, a decision had already been made. Not out loud, not for the public, but permanent. Because Byron Nelson did not argue, he did not criticize. He did not need to explain himself. If a man lost his respect, he simply never got it back. And over time, there were a few names. 5 men who stood on the same fairways, played the same game, chased the same trophies, but never stood in the same place. In his eyes, he did not raise his voice. He did not need to, because by the time Byron Nelson reached his prime, the game itself had already begun to bend around him. This was the golden age of golf, a time when the sport still carried a certain stillness. Fairways were quieter, crowds were closer, and reputations were built not through noise, but through repetition, through consistency, through control, and no one embodied that better than Nelson. He did not look like the most intimidating man on the course. He did not carry himself like a showman. There was no dramatic flair in the way he walked, no tension in his posture, no need to command attention. But when he played, something shifted. It was not just that he won, it was how often he refused to lose. Week after week, tournament after tournament, he moved through the field with a kind of precision that made other players uncomfortable. Not because it was aggressive, but because it was relentless. There were no wasted motions, no emotional swings, no visible cracks, and in a sport where even the greatest could falter under pressure, Nelson seemed almost untouched by it. Other players talked. They argued. They explained their bad rounds, defended their decisions, filled the silence with reasons. Nelson never did. If something went wrong, he corrected it. If something worked, he repeated it. That was all. And over time, that quiet discipline became something more than just a playing style. It became a standard, not officially, not spoken, but understood. Because when a man performs at that level, without excuses, without distractions, he begins to define what is acceptable, and more importantly, what is not. The locker rooms of that era were filled with different kinds of players. Some relied on instinct. Some chased attention. Some let the pressure change them. And Nelson watched all of it. Carefully, quietly. He did not judge out loud, but he noticed. He noticed who stayed the same, and who didn't. He noticed who respected the game, and who treated it like a stage. And over time, those observations became decisions. Not emotional ones, measured ones, permanent ones. Because to Byron Nelson, respect was not about talent. It was about discipline, about control, about the ability to remain the same man, no matter what the scoreboard said. And there were a few players, no matter how gifted, no matter how successful, who failed that test. Number 5, Sam Snead. There are players who learn the game, and then there are players who seem to have been born with it. Sam Snead belonged to the second kind. His swing did not look constructed. It did not look rehearsed. It moved like something natural, almost effortless, as if the club had always been an extension of his body. People would watch him and forget how difficult golf really was. He made it look easy. And in a game built on control, that kind of ease could be both admired and quietly questioned. Because where Snead relied on feel, Byron Nelson relied on structure. Where Snead trusted instinct, Nelson trusted repetition. The difference was not obvious at first. They both won. They both commanded attention. They both stood at the top of the same era. But if you watched closely, you could see it in the spaces between their rounds. Snead was comfortable letting the game breathe. He joked. He moved lightly. There were moments when it felt like he was playing with the course rather than against it. Nelson never did that. To him, golf was not something to be played with. It was something to be managed. Every shot had a place. Every decision had a reason. There was no room for looseness, not at the highest level. And this is where the distance began. Not through conflict, not through words, but through philosophy. There were rounds where Snead would recover from mistakes with brilliance, bending the game back in his favor with raw talent. The crowd loved it, the unpredictability, the flashes of genius. But Nelson saw something else. He saw inconsistency. He saw reliance on moments instead of control. And for a man who built his entire career on eliminating uncertainty, that was something he could never fully accept. There was no confrontation between them, no argument that history remembers. But there was a difference in the way Nelson stood around him, a slight detachment, a quiet separation. As if, no matter how great Snead became, he had chosen a path Nelson would never walk. And in Byron Nelson's world, that was enough. Number 4, Ben Hogan. Before the distance, there was closeness. Before the silence, there was understanding. Ben Hogan and Byron Nelson did not begin as rivals. They began as something far more complicated. They came from the same ground, Texas. The same dust, the same long days, the same quiet determination that shaped men who did not expect anything to be given to them. They traveled together. They learned the game side by side. There was a time when their names were spoken in the same breath, not as opponents, but as companions moving through the same uncertain path. But something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically. The change came slowly. In the way their approaches began to separate. Hogan was relentless, not in the way Nelson was. Nelson sought control. Hogan sought perfection. And there is a difference. Control accepts limits. Perfection refuses them. Hogan chased something that could never fully be reached. He rebuilt his swing piece by piece. He studied every motion. He turned the game into a problem that had to be solved completely. And in doing so, he became something colder, more distant, more consumed. Nelson watched this transformation from closer than anyone else. He understood the discipline. He respected the work. But there was something in Hogan's pursuit, something that crossed a line Nelson would never cross himself. Because at some point, the game stopped being about playing and became about conquering. There were no public disputes between them, no sharp words, no visible fracture. But the space between them grew. In locker rooms, on practice grounds, in the quiet moments where two men who once stood side by side no longer stood together. Hogan continued forward, carving his name into the game with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Nelson continued in his own way, steady, controlled, unchanged. And that difference mattered. Because to Nelson, the game demanded respect, not domination, not obsession, respect. And somewhere along the way, without ever saying it, he stopped seeing Hogan the same way, not as a rival, not as a friend, but as a man who had chosen a path he could never truly agree with. Number 3, Gene Sarazen. Some men bring attention to the game. Others become the reason the game is watched. Gene Sarazen understood something that many in his era did not. He understood presence. He knew how to step into a moment and make it larger than it was. The galleries followed him not just for his score, but for the way he carried himself between shots. There was confidence in his stride, a sense that the game at times revolved around him. And in many ways, it did. He belonged to a slightly earlier generation, one that helped shape the public image of golf. His victories mattered, his name carried weight, and when he spoke, people listened. But where Sarazen leaned into that visibility, Byron Nelson moved in the opposite direction. Nelson did not seek the moment. He reduced it. He stripped it down until only the shot remained. There were no gestures meant for the crowd, no pauses designed to be remembered, just execution, again and again. And over time, that difference became more than style. It became a quiet disagreement about what the game was supposed to be. Sarazen embraced the spotlight. Nelson stepped away from it. Sarazen allowed personality to shape the moment. Nelson believed the moment should disappear once the ball was struck. There were tournaments where their paths crossed, where two very different versions of the same game existed side by side. One drew the eye. The other held the line. The crowd could feel it, even if they could not explain it, because one man made the game feel alive in a visible way, and the other made it feel controlled, almost inevitable. Nelson never criticized Sarazen. He never needed to, but there were moments, subtle ones, where the distance showed, a lack of engagement, a refusal to fully connect, as if the performance, the presence, the need to be seen, took something away from what Nelson believed golf demanded. To him, the game was not a stage. It was a discipline, and any part of it that drifted toward performance, no matter how celebrated, was something he could never fully accept. So he did what he always did. He stayed quiet. He kept his distance, and he moved on, unchanged. Number 2, Ralph Guldahl. There is a different kind of failure in golf, not the kind that comes from lack of talent, but the kind that comes after you have already proven you belong. Ralph Guldahl was not an ordinary player. For a brief period, he stood exactly where the game demanded its best to stand. He won. He dominated. He looked for a moment like a man who had solved something others were still searching for. And then, it slipped. Not all at once, but enough for people to notice. There are many explanations that followed. Changes in technique. Too much attention. Too many voices offering advice. The kind of pressure that does not arrive loudly, but settles slowly until nothing feels natural anymore. Guldahl began to adjust. He studied his own swing. He tried to refine what had already worked, and in doing so, he lost it. For most players, that story is understood with sympathy. Golf is fragile. Confidence is fragile. Even the best can fall. But Byron Nelson did not see it that way. Not completely. Because to him, the game was not just about reaching the top. It was about staying there, without losing yourself. Guldahl had something rare, and then he changed it. Not because he had to, but because something around him, or within him, told him it was not enough. And that, more than the decline itself, was what Nelson could not accept. There were no confrontations between them, no visible disagreement. But there was a quiet shift in how Nelson regarded him. Less certainty, less regard. As if in Nelson's eyes, the fall was not just unfortunate, it was avoidable. Because discipline to Nelson meant trusting what you had built, not dismantling it in search of something better. Guldahl's story became a caution, not about losing, but about changing when nothing needed to change. And in a world where Nelson valued stability above all else, that was enough to draw a line. He did not say it. He did not explain it. But from that point on, respect was no longer there. Number 1, Craig Wood. There are players who reach the summit, and there are players who know how to remain there. Craig Wood was one of the finest talents of his time. There was no question about that. His game was strong, his presence was steady, and when everything aligned, he could stand with anyone in the field and not look out of place. He won the biggest titles the sport could offer. He proved more than once that he belonged among the very best. But golf has always asked a second question. Not how high you can climb, but how long you can stay. And this is where the separation begins. Wood's career was marked by moments of brilliance, followed by stretches where that same level could not be held. Not because he lacked ability, but because something in his approach did not carry the same weight, the same consistency, the same refusal to break. To most, that is part of the game. Form rises, form falls. Even great players drift in and out. But Byron Nelson did not measure greatness that way. He did not look at a single victory and call it proof. He looked for patterns, for control, for the ability to return, again and again, to the same standard. And when that pattern was not there, something was missing. There were rounds where Wood looked untouchable, and there were others where that sharpness faded. The difference was not always obvious to the crowd, but Nelson noticed. He always noticed, because to him, inconsistency was not just a weakness. It was a break in discipline, a sign that something somewhere was not being held together the way it should. There were no words exchanged, no public judgment. But in the quiet spaces where Nelson formed his opinions, Wood did not pass the test, not because he failed, but because he could not sustain. And in Nelson's world, that mattered more than anything else. So he remained as he always did, calm, respectful, distant, but never fully convinced. Because for Byron Nelson, respect was not given to moments. It was given to permanence. There is something strange about silence. It does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. And yet, over time, it reveals more than words ever could. Byron Nelson never needed to explain who he respected. He showed it in the way he stood near certain men, in the way conversations lasted just a little longer, in the way presence felt different. And he never needed to explain who he did not, because the absence was enough, a shorter exchange, a quieter acknowledgement, a distance that never closed. To most people, respect is simple. You win, and you earn it. You achieve, and it is given. But Nelson did not see it that way. To him, the game was not just about results. It was about how those results were built, how a man held himself when things went right, and more importantly, when they did not. The 5 men in this story were not failures. They were champions, talented, respected by the world. But in small, almost invisible ways, they stepped outside the line Nelson never crossed. Some trusted instinct over structure. Some chased perfection until it consumed them. Some allowed the game to become a stage. Some changed what did not need changing. And some could not remain steady at the top. None of these were crimes. None of these erased their greatness. But to Nelson, they mattered, because he believed the game asked something deeper from those who played it. Not just skill, not just victory, but discipline, consistency, restraint, and above all, respect for the game itself. That is why he never raised his voice. That is why he never argued, because he did not need to. He had already decided. Quietly, completely, and permanently, a man can be admired by millions. He can be remembered as one of the greatest to ever play. But in the end, respect is not something you receive from the crowd. It is something you earn from the men who see everything. And Byron Nelson saw more than most.